Hi, I'm Frank and welcome to my wood turning channel. A few months ago I rough turned 4 burls and I put them in my kiln, and now they're dry, so let's have a look at them and see how they turned out, and then we'll proceed to finish them. Well, they don't look too bad. Looks like they've dried all right without too many cracks. And in the same batch you can see I had some ash vases here, and they look like they came through pretty good. And just as a reminder, my kiln is just powered by a couple of different light bulbs at different wattages to get the temperature I'm after. Just as a reminder, these are maple burls, and I rough turned these probably 3 months ago. Now they've been dry, but this is the first chance I've had to get to the kiln. And there are cracks through the center of all of these, and these didn't really develop through the process. They were just always there. Maybe the drying process made the cracks a little bit bigger, but they were always there, and these need to be filled with epoxy just for structural reasons. I'm just afraid these big heavy burls will fall apart. So here I'm just taping the back of it, and I'm going to use some epoxy to fill the cracks in the best I can, and that way hopefully these will be much safer to turn. I'm just going to use the standard System 3 general purpose epoxy. This is just a normal 2-part epoxy. This isn't for deep pours or anything like that. And this should work well for the cracks I'm dealing with. And I put a bit of black pigment in there as well, because that's the color I'd like to use in this particular case. I did have to do 2 or 3 applications to make sure all the cracks were filled, but it worked out not too badly. After taping up the inside, I also did the same procedure and put epoxy in the cracks on the outside. And here you can see I had to use a few little plastic areas to contain the epoxy so they would actually go deep into the cracks. But I think it's safe enough now that it should be all right. Normally I would leave the ends squared, but here I'm taking a carbide cutting tool, the Arbor-Tech, and just softening up the edges. I do that sometimes to some of the burls, and there was epoxy on the end, so this sort of served 2 purposes. Just going to round the ends a little bit, and it gets rid of the epoxy right on the very end. Another thing I'm going to do with this particular piece is I'm just going to darken the edges. It'll make it look like it's live edge all the way around, even on those carved ends that I did with the Arbortech. It just gives it a bit of a dark effect all the way around. It's not actual live edge everywhere, but it looks a little bit more like live edge everywhere. These pieces are just a little bit more than 25 inches in diameter, so instead of using my robust, I've taken it over to my Laguna lathe and moved the headstock right to the end and used this outboard attachment, which allows me to use much larger diameters with tailstock support. Here I'm just measuring up the dimensions for the tenon. I have to true it up because it's warped through the drying process. And I'm just going to use a dovetail tenon with my Vicmark jaws. I'm using a 1/2 inch bowl gouge, and I'll use a 1/2 inch skew to just true up the tenon. Now I've switched to the 5/8 inch bowl gouge, and I'll see how that works for taking the epoxy off. There isn't a really thick layer, so hopefully this will work fine and I won't have to use carbide tools. Bowl gouge seems to be doing a good job. It is getting a little bit dull with the epoxy, but not too bad. These intermittent cuts are a bit tricky way out here at the wings, so I'm getting a few ridges and that sort of thing which I'll need to clean up. So I'm going to clean up some of those ridges with this negative rake scraper. This is a Glenn Lucas Hamlet tool. Yeah, nice heavy tool. It does a good job for negative rake scraping. The burr on the negative rake scraper does the cutting, and it doesn't last all that long with this hard burl. So you can see me here, I'm just reapplying the burr by taking it to the grinder. The bottom of the piece turned out all right. I'm pretty happy with it. I'm sure glad the epoxy was used because that crack runs all the way through the piece, and I'm really afraid it would have come apart on me if I didn't fill it with epoxy. So now I'm going to just work on the top of the piece. I know the piece looks like it's going pretty fast, but actually that's only because my video is sped up. I'm actually turning relatively slow because the piece is shaking the lathe a little bit. So I'm turning as fast as I can. It's probably only 400, 500, 600 RPM. There are still some cracks showing up here, so I have to be a bit careful not to make the piece too thin. I think I'm going to actually apply some CA glue to the cracks and just harden those up and just make sure nothing dangerous happens with them coming apart or anything like that. There was one large crack that opened up, and I don't really want to make up a new batch of epoxy, so I'm just going to fill that crack with some coffee, which is dark enough that it looks black, and I'll put some CA glue over the coffee, and at least cosmetically that will kind of seal things up a little bit, and it also does provide a little bit of strength with the CA glue. If you're enjoying the video, please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. That really helps in the analytics and gives me a bit of incentive to keep doing more of these. It's always good to just check your thickness with some calipers, just to make sure you're not getting too thin or you're leaving it too thick. You may see me switch back and forth here between gouges. I tend to use the 5/8 inch gouge to do the roughing, and then I pick up a 1/2 inch sharpened gouge to do the final cut. Here you can see that crack that's running all the way through the piece. I just hope there's enough epoxy in there to hold the piece together. It still looks a bit dangerous, but I'll just take the cuts slowly here and hope for the best. I'm just going to use my bottoming bowl gouge here to finish the bottom area and try to get the best cut I can there. I don't show a lot of the detailed sanding, but pieces like this sometimes actually take me longer to sand the piece than it does to turn the piece. It's just a lot of stationary sanding on the edges and then doing the rotational sanding where I can. After fully sanding the front and back of the piece, I'm now turning it around and putting it on a jam chuck with tailstock support, and I'm just going to clean off the bottom here with a 1/2 inch gouge, and then I'll sand it as well. Now I'm just finishing the piece off with a general salad bowl finish. It's a finish I typically use on most of my burls. So it's just a wipe on and wipe off type finish. And 2 or 3 coats will do it. This particular piece actually only took 2 coats.